Caleb, thanks for joining us on the Mother of All talk shows. Let's start with that latter point, if we may. According to CNN, many Americans are ready to pay $15 a gallon for their gas just to stand up to Russia. Is that your experience so far?
Well, that's the experience of perhaps some wealthy members of the middle class. I'm sure that Joe Biden's personal inner circle and many of his millionaire and billionaire backers would feel that way. But average Americans, I don't think so. Average Americans are probably not excited about having to pay so much more for gasoline, especially when they're already having to pay more for food. They're having to pay more for other needed items. I mean, the inflation in the United States is insane. I mean, the price of gasoline at this point has gone up 75 cents already this year. I mean, that is a huge rise. And average Americans are being told now by Joe Biden, it's not his fault. It's not his fault. It's all Putin's fault. And we should expect this. This is our duty to stand with Ukraine against those evil Russians. Well, I can guarantee you there are a lot of Americans that are saying, I'm sorry, I've got to feed my family. I'm more concerned about making sure my kids have enough to eat, making sure I can drive to work and drive home from work and drive my kids to school in the morning. They're more concerned about that than arming the Azov Battalion and making sure that the people of Donetsk and Lugansk continue to face a bombardment. And while the U.S. media is doing a lot with, not just CNN and Fox, but social media is whipping up this anti-Russia hysteria, I think there are a lot of Americans that are looking at their own checkbooks, looking at their own wallet and saying, wait a second, who's paying the costs here? Because since the beginning of this pandemic, the richest of the rich have made out like bandits. This has been a great pandemic for Jeff Bezos. This has been a tremendous pandemic for the Walton family that own Walmart. But all through middle America, you have stores closing, small businesses shutting down. Average Americans are very, very worried. We've got this inflation rising. And Joe Biden now feels he can just scapegoat it all onto Russia. I think a lot of Americans know who's really to blame.
Now, one of the ways they won't know, I'm looking on your screen, it says RT America, which no longer exists, and you're out of work. In the land of the free, how easy a decision was it for the American government to close Sputnik Radio and close RT America?
It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. All employees of RT America, including myself, we received a notice of layoff. I cleared out my desk. The studio in New York City where I work, where I have my office, where I do my lives, it's shut down. And the same in Washington, D.C., and the same in Miami, and the same in Los Angeles. RT America is no more, from what we understand. And that's a lot of Americans, and a lot of whom, had different views. I think that Russia is doing the right thing in Ukraine, as difficult as it is. I think they've waited 8 years to protect the peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk. And at this point, they're moving in to try and end an 8-year war. But not everyone who worked at RT America felt that way. There was wider variety of perspective on RT America than on any cable network. On RT America, you had conservatives, you had liberals, you had libertarians, you had socialists. You had a wide variety of views, different perspectives, different opinions. They called us propaganda. Propaganda pushes one viewpoint, pushes one opinion, one perspective. We were the opposite of propaganda. We were the anti-propaganda. And now, as you see the hysteria being whipped up about Ukraine in the United States, in the universities, on social media, et cetera, you can see why we are absolutely necessary. And my hope is that things can change and that RT America can return. Because we should be allowed to be part of the discourse. There are different views on international events, for goodness sakes. There are two sides of every story. Could you imagine if they were to only allow, one view of the American Civil War? If we only got to watch Gone with the Wind and listen to Miss Scarlett say, I do declare, Captain Butler, these Yankees are coming down here and freeing our slaves. It's awful. Imagine if there was only one perspective on the American Civil War. We would never stand for that. And there should be more than one perspective on the situation in Ukraine. But now in American media, they are not only trying to make sure that other perspectives aren't heard, they're actively shutting it down. My personal Twitter account, which has nothing to do with Russia. No one in Russia tells me what to tweet. No one in Russia has anything to do with my Twitter, has been labeled by Twitter as Russian state affiliate media. I'm from Ohio. I don't speak a word of Russian. Nobody from my family is Russian. I'm an Irish American. I have a right to have my views. I am not a Russian state affiliated media. That is ridiculous. And this has been done to other journalists. Rachel Blevins has been tagged. Manila Chan of RT America has been tagged. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous cancel culture censorship. We have the right to put our perspectives out there. You know, just because we work at a Russian company doesn't mean we're not human beings, doesn't mean we don't have our own views. That's ridiculous.
Well, you say you have a right, but it turns out you don't have a right. This is what we're discovering, isn't it? That all the rights and liberties that we thought we had, some of us were skeptical, but we still in our hearts hoped we had, and some of which in your country were guaranteed in a constitution, in a Bill of Rights. It turns out that we don't have. The owners of the public square are not the public, but high big tech billionaires.
Sure. Silicon Valley and the amount of power concentrated in their hands, George, is astronomical. They have the ability to sway elections. They have the ability to influence all kinds of things with their algorithms. You want to talk about an exponential amount of power. And it's also important to remember that Silicon Valley, you know, the tech giants, they weren't created synthetically. They didn't just come out of nowhere. We're constantly fed this story that there were a bunch of nerds who were tinkering around in their garages and they invented computers, and that's how great the free market is, blah, blah, blah. That's not what happened. There was a strategic decision made by U.S. intelligence agencies during the late 1970s and 80s during the Cold War. They started pouring government money in there. It's the National Security Agency of the United States, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. There's the ones that created Silicon Valley. They knew that even though the Soviet Union was very advanced in their computer technology, they didn't have the same level of funding that we have in the United States. And it was the intelligence agencies that made the United States the center of the computer revolution and really created Silicon Valley. That's why, you know, you'll remember Al Gore, why saying, I invented the internet. Well, what he meant was that a strategic decision was made by U.S. intelligence and the U.S. military to move ahead with creating what is now Silicon Valley. And yes, it enables them to manipulate world events. Look at what happened during the Arab Spring. We now know that Hillary Clinton had in her State Department Jared Andrew Cohen, who was on the board of Google Alphabet, and he was working to make sure that Twitter and Facebook and other social media outlets were moving in a certain way that was strategic for the United States and damaging toward Iran during the Arab Spring. This is a fact. You can look at this, that Silicon Valley and the U.S. State Department manipulated the Arab Spring to hurt Iran and to benefit U.S. foreign policy. That's a fact. And so we know that Silicon Valley is very much a tool of the forces that want to dominate the world for big corporations and banks based in Wall Street and in London. That is a fact. But the reality is, once this technology gets invented, it doesn't get uninvented. And eventually, there are going to be alternatives to the U.S. social media giants like Facebook and Twitter that are based in different parts of the world. That's why they're so terrified of TikTok. TikTok has bent over backwards not to cooperate with the Chinese government, not to be available on the Chinese mainland. They're still terrified of it because they know what it represents. Think back to feudalism, right? At the time of feudalism, you know, the Bibles, was printed in the printing press. The printing presses were all controlled by the Catholic Church. But pretty soon, critics of the Catholic Church started printing their own Bibles and started having their own ability to use the printing press for their information. And that's the way it works with modern information technology. Sure, modern social media may be dominated by Wall Street and the tech monopolies, but pretty soon alternative forces that are pushing back against them are going to have the ability to utilize social media, and they're going to have their own social media outlets. And this monopoly that the tech giants hold on to and cling to, the tighter they tighten their grip, the more censorship they put on it, it only expedites. It's only a matter of time before pretty soon they will lose their monopoly and there will be free speech alternatives to Twitter, Facebook, etc. And they know this. It's only a matter of time before they lose their monopoly on information. And they're scrambling to do damage control right now.
Now, as we both agree, this is a quite unprecedented blizzard of propaganda and censorship that we're going through, it's all the more unusual in that our countries are not actually involved in this war on the face of it. I had far more freedom to speak during the Iraq War, for example, when my own country was actually in the war, than I do now in a war that we are not, on the face of it, participating in. And also, there are other differences. In the Iraq War, we had a vast anti-war movement. Now we don't. And that vast anti-war movement had a left, and its left was clear about the main issues involved in the conflict, in the run-up to and during the conflict. That's no longer true either. As a matter of fact, many of the left, as they define themselves, are supporting NATO. They're supporting the Twibbons. They are echoing the tropes of the NATO propagandists, at least here in Britain. How is it in the US?
Well, look, I think that we have to remember that Joe Biden and his administration contains a lot of followers of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski was the strategist of the late Cold War. He served as national security advisor in the Carter administration. And what they are very good at doing is turning things around, presenting the United States as if it's not the aggressor and making other countries look like they are the aggressor. And that creates a situation where a lot of people on the left, they sympathize with people who are victimized. We sympathize with workers on the job who are victimized by their employers. We sympathize with the countries around the world that the USA victimizes with its drones and its tanks and its bombs. And so reinventing the message where somehow Ukraine is the victim and Russia is the aggressor, it is a weird psychological operation. And this is what Jimmy Carter did with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And we now know they called it the Afghan trap. They created a situation where the Soviet leaders felt they had to intervene in Afghanistan, and then they cranked up the propaganda. Those Afghans are being attacked by the evil Soviet Union. They made a James Bond movie where the Mujahideen of Afghanistan were the heroes fighting the Soviets, and they tried to reverse the narrative to appeal to the part of us, many of us who are on the left. I consider myself a leftist. Many of us who are on the left, we want to sympathize with the downtrodden and with the oppressed, right? And so they flip the script, and it's a very effective strategy. But what people need to remember is that Ukraine is not an independent country. Starting in 2014, when the USA toppled the government of Ukraine, it stopped being independent. It became a colony of the United States, and the United States is there. The EU countries are there. There's a whole network of advisors, and Zelensky doesn't really run Ukraine. He came into office promising that he would bring the country back together. He would de-escalate conflict. He hasn't been able to do that because he's not really in power. Ukraine is just an outpost of American imperialism. And the people in the eastern regions, in Donetsk and Lugansk, who've been facing bombing and shelling for 8 years, 14,000 of them are dead, they're victims, and no one ever talks about them. On CNN, they don't exist. They just don't exist in American media. But for 8 years, they have faced bombing and shelling and drone strikes and a food blockade from the United States. They have been victimized, and Russia has said, reintegrate them back into Ukraine. We don't want to recognize their independent republics. Implement the Minsk Accords, reintegrate them back into Ukraine. And it's been 8 years, and finally, with the Minsk Accords not being signed and not being carried out, they have been signed, but they haven't been carried out. At this point, Russia is recognizing them, and it is stepping in to offer them protection and beat back the Ukrainian military that the United States has been arming. Look, one part of this conflict that nobody in the United States is talking about that must be touched on is this. In the United States, could you imagine if there was some judge or some governor in some state who said, you know, I think English is the language of the United States. So if somebody speaks Spanish, if a Latino or a Chicano in the United States speaks Spanish, we're going to write them a ticket, and we're going to drag them into court, and we're going to fine them for speaking their own language. If that happened in the United States, we would never stand for that. We would call that racism. We would call it out. We would oppose it. That's what the Ukrainian government has been doing to Russian-speaking peoples within their own borders for the past 8 years, dragging them to court, punishing them for speaking their own language. And they have declared independence. They have broken away. And Russia has said, no, we'd like Ukraine to just recognize you. give you autonomy, reintegrate you back into Ukrainian society. We have a treaty, the Minsk Accords, that says that that's what's supposed to happen, but the Ukrainian government hasn't done it. Instead, it's been bombing and shelling these people. It's subjected them to a food blockade. It's locked people in prison for their social media posts. It's shut down TV channels. And finally, after 8 years, Russia says, okay, we have to move in and protect these people. You can't keep killing Russian-speaking people on our border. We're going to move in and protect them. Russia is not the aggressor here. The United States toppled the Ukrainian government. The United States has poured all kinds of lethal weapons into Ukraine, and that's what people need to understand. But it's by flipping the script and following that Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter strategy, that's how they've been able to kind of maneuver and manipulate a lot of left-wing forces, and that's what we need to understand about what's going on right now.
Now, you'll presumably be dealing with the current crisis in your important political conference coming up this weekend. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Some great folks are going to be there. Jackson Hinkle is going to be there. Samira Khan is going to be there. We're going to hear from Haas of the infrared community. We're going to hear from Peter Coffin. I'm going to be there. We're going to have speakers. We're going to talk about their recent trip to Nicaragua. We're going to talk about what's really going on in Donetsk and Lugansk. We're going to have messages from a lot of different forces around the world, including yourself. I'm very excited to hear what your remarks to our conference will be. And many people are coming in from around the country, but we anticipate protests outside. We have spent a lot of money on security because we anticipate a lot of people are going to want to shut this down. But, when I think about this, I think about how during the Cold War, back in 1949, the great Albert Einstein spoke at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in 1949 at the Peace Conference, along with Shostakovich and Lillian Hellman, against the danger of nuclear war in 1949 amid the McCarthyite witch hunts, and how they convened that great peace conference in New York City to stand up against the danger of nuclear war, to tell the truth about what was really going on in Europe. And at the time NATO was being formed, what it was really being formed for. So I take inspiration from the past. There's a long history of Americans like Eugene Debs, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others standing up against the war drive and the propaganda of the U.S. government. So I would say that, I am a patriotic American. I love my country. And that is why I don't want people from Ohio or Pennsylvania or Texas or Alabama to go get sent to Ukraine to go and get shot for Joe Biden or for the Azov Battalion. To really love America, you have to stand against the dangerous escalation with Russia, because it's bad for America. It's bad for American working families. It's bad for our communities. It's bad for the world. It's hurting everyone. It doesn't benefit anyone but the Wall Street oil banking elites, the Pentagon weapons contractors. It doesn't benefit the working people of the world from the United States or any other country in the world. And I have a patriotic duty to stand against this war, and we are going to convene a very important conference. A lot of people are opposing us, but that means we're doing our job. If people aren't calling us out, or people aren't reacting to us, it would mean no one's hearing us. So the fact that we're getting so many threats, I guess you could say, it shows that we are saying what needs to be said in an atmosphere where our message is largely being unheard and needs to be heard desperately.
How can people follow it, Caleb? Are you going to live stream it?
Video will be up afterwards. It's March 12th, Saturday. It'll be in Austin, Texas. It'll be at the South Park Hotel. Doors open at 1 o'clock. Video will be on the web afterwards. We welcome anyone to come. We're not going to obviously allow any disruption. There'll be a lot of security. Be prepared to go through a metal detector. Be prepared to show some ID at the door. But other than that, you're welcome to come. And we would like people to be there, people from all walks of life, ask good questions. There'll be some good music as well, some classic American Woody Guthrie folk music. Classical pianist is going to perform. It's going to be a great afternoon, so I hope people will come out.
Just make sure the classical pianist doesn't play Tchaikovsky, because that appears to be off the agenda here in Britain, at least. I wish I could be there in person. I will be there on screen. Caleb Maupin, as always, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.